guys, and welcome back. So today I'm working on a pretty simple little watercolor piece. I wanted this one to be relatively simple, like I mentioned, because I did want it to be one that I didn't have to speed up nearly as much as some of my bigger, more elaborate watercolor paintings. So this one I wanted it to be a little bit closer to the normal speed that I do it at. That way you can see a little bit better the details and the brushwork and all of that stuff. So hopefully it's a little bit clearer and enjoyable on that aspect of it. But yeah, I did, when I went about this, I wanted the layering to be something that was a little bit more minimal than what I sometimes do, because I did just want this to be really just a piece that I could sit down and enjoy it and get it done and move on to the next piece. And I do feel pretty accomplished with that. I do think that it ended up being as simple as I wanted it to, or a lot of times I will overthink things like this and then end up adding too many layers or too many details and too many embellishments at the end. So I think that this one, as far as the simplicity of it and the execution of it, I think that I did stick to what I actually had in mind at the beginning, which is pretty exciting for traditional stuff like this. I usually go a little bit too overboard. But I think that probably the one thing that I found the most frustrating and negative about this piece is actually the tools that I was using. So when I do my line work, pretty much 90% of the time I use a bottle of ink and a brush, and I love it. It is definitely by far my favorite method of doing line art. And the thing that I had a problem with when I was doing this is one that I knew it was coming and I expected it. So it's by no means something that I'm like complaining about the tools or the method or anything. It's just, I wish that I had thought about it a little bit sooner. But the brushes that I use, you have to have them super, super sharp to be able to get really fine line work. And I actually use a round 0 brush and sometimes a round 00. And the one that I'm using right now is actually Winsor & Newton. And I'll have a link to the brush that I'm using and all of the tools and everything down below. But the brushes that I use, because they're so fine and I'm using them for such tiny detail, is that once they start warping even the tiniest bit from age and from use, they are not very good for doing line work anymore. And then I switch them over to being just a regular watercolor brush, which is great. But this one, it was definitely towards the end of its lifespan and I hadn't bought a new one yet. So I had to use this brush, and it was, like I mentioned, curling in on itself to one side so that it made the line work a lot chunkier and harder to control in some areas and much more unpredictable. So there'd be areas where the brush would kind of flick out a little bit and make one little chunk a little bit thicker, so I'd have to thicken the whole thing so it looks smooth. So yeah, it's just, I knew it was happening, that brush. I knew that it was time to replace it, and I just didn't quite make it to getting a new brush. So that is entirely on me. But when I use a brush like this, it just reminds me how grateful I am when I do have a really sharp brush that I have complete control over, and it's reliable, and I know what kind of brush strokes it's going to do. So this really just helped me learn that I need to have backups of all the tools that I use a lot of and I know that are going to be disposable. So when I go to get a new brush, I'm going to make sure that I get a second brush so that it can just sit in my back room and wait until I'm ready to replace my new one. But also, towards the end of the inking process in this video, you can actually see it, but I knock over my almost full bottle of ink all over. I was so shocked by it, I guess. I did not see that happening, but I did spill almost all of the ink out of the bottle, and I cleaned it up. But the relief was that I still had another bottle in the back. I had actually had the forethought to buy an extra bottle of that because I love it and I use it and I go through it a lot. So for once I actually did have a spare ready for it, and I'm trying to think that way a little bit more, making sure that I have spares of all the tools that I use frequently like this and the colors that I use a lot of. That way I'm never to the point where I have a piece ready and I'm excited to work on it and I have an idea in my head and I don't have that one particular tool or that specific color, because nothing is more frustrating or derailing from, your coloring and your painting process than when you're not having all the tools that you feel like you usually have. So yeah, I think I definitely want to get better at being more well-stocked into the future. But it's one of those things that I am trying to be a little bit more thoughtful about for the future, is just being prepared for all of those things like that. And for this one, I actually had a pretty clear idea of what the color palette I wanted to use from the very beginning. And it actually came from my painting palette itself, because I got a new palette, which I absolutely love. It's huge, it has tons of space to grow, and I got a bunch of new pigments and paints, and that was really exciting. So when I had been trying them out earlier this week, I had mixed up some of the colors together, some of my new ones, so I still had this really gorgeous cobalt violet out and quinacridone violet, and then I also had this minty green on the other side of the palette. And I love those two colors together. It looked really gorgeous. And I have this new neutral tint, which is, as it sounds, more of a neutral gray than my Payne's gray, which is much more of a cool blue-based gray. So I had all those out already mixed up on my palette and everything, and I loved how it looked. So I decided I wanted to use those for this painting. And it was really nice because they were already on my palette. I just had to re-wet them and use them. And I have to say, that is one of my all-time favorite things about using watercolor, is that any paint that I don't use for a painting, it's still there and it's still completely reactivatable. And there's just no wasted paint. Whereas when I had used acrylic, that is, I would always overmix the paints, or I would undermix and not have enough. And nothing feels worse than wasting art supplies when you know that you didn't have to waste it. So watercolor is just so seamless from going from one to the next and using all your paints and just getting the use out of it, and it's just so clean. So I love watercolor, but I did really love that I was able to just get inspiration from my palette itself and what was happening there. And right about here is kind of another big reason why I love watercolors. It's where I'm doing this big flat wash of color for the background. So the other tools that I use that are similar to this, really my only other traditional tool that is Copic markers. And you just cannot get a smooth wash like this with those markers. You'll always get a streak, always. But with watercolors, once you learn how to get a nice smooth wash and you practice it, it's just so effortless compared to like I said, markers. It's just really pleasant to be able to get something so clean like that. But one of the biggest things to remember when you're doing flat washes like this, that'll make it nice and easy and simple, is just making sure that the edges are very wet. That's where you need to focus on, is have a lot of that color that you're going to do the flat wash with mixed up and ready. And as you're spreading it out, make sure that you just wet every area. So if you need to go in and do a lot of detailing in one area and leave another area for a little while, make sure that you pick up some of that color and drop it down so you have a nice thick bubble of water around the edge of it, so that when you get back to that area up there, you can spread it out and it's still really wet. That's just the key to getting nice flat washes when you're using watercolor, is controlling the water and making sure that all the edges are very wet, so that when you spread it out, it blends together. It really is very simple. You just have to practice it a little bit and then you can get the hang of it. And there's definitely times where I've messed up a few of my nice flat washes by going back over an area that was already dry, and then it kind of blossoms out. But once you kind of get aware of making sure that it's wet and that you don't go back over areas that are dry, it's such a pleasure to do. I love doing flat washes. It's just really pleasant. And one of the things that I actually think was really small to implement but made a big difference in the overall final look was these little like leaf feather shapes that I added that were expanding past where her bodice is, where it was overlapping with her arms and her hair a little bit. Before that, it felt a little bit disconnected, that shape, and the shape that was in the bodice just wasn't reflected anywhere else within the piece, so it felt very disconnected. And once I added those little ones that overlapped her, it connected them back together and it added a little extra interest to it. It also had a similar black look to the spiky crown that she had, so it connected a little bit more with that. So once I added those, I felt a lot happier with the overall look of this piece. It felt more cohesive and it had a little bit more of a spark of an interest to it. And that is it for today's piece. It was pretty simple and to the point, and I liked being able to just sit down and paint it. But as usual, my original is available, so if you'd like to own her, she's available at my shop. There will be a link down in the description, as well as one in my end card that'll take you to my art shop with her and all of my other buttons and prints and such. But yeah, she's available, and if you haven't subscribed yet, please do. I upload every Tuesdays, Thursdays, and Saturdays. So that is it for today, but I'll see you guys at my next video.